Welcome to The Human Variable, where we learn about the complicated intertwining of science and public policy. Let's jump straight into this week's topic, headed by Jeffrey Dewey.
And the man is wearing like a rubber fright mask, a fright wig, an oversized tuxedo, and he's using a voice-disguising microphone. If you're listeners, you can just Google Dr. Anonymous and you can see a picture of what he looked like. And that's what an openly gay psychiatrist had to look like in 1972.
Hello, listeners. I'm your host for today's episode, Jeffrey Dewey. I'm a fifth-year chemistry PhD student at the University of Chicago. I'm joined by my colleagues, Christina Roman and Mark DeTusa.
Hey, y'all, this is Mark DeTusa. I'm a fifth-year physics graduate student at UChicago, and I'm proud to be from Baton Rouge, go to LSU, Louisiana State University for undergrad. Go Tigers!
Hi, I'm Christina Roman. I'm a sixth-year biochemistry PhD student at the University of Chicago.
In today's episode, I'll be interviewing psychiatrist Dr. Jack Drescher about the history of homosexuality being classified as a mental disorder. We will also discuss how scientists and activists came together to fight for the declassification of homosexuality as a mental disorder. I also interviewed Dr. Kristen Schilt, professor of sociology at the University of Chicago. She will touch on how bias manifests in scientific research and what we can do to avoid these biases. Christina and Mark will be popping in throughout the episode to discuss and unpack our guests' expertise. Let's turn now to Dr. Jack Drescher. We are now joined by Jack Drescher, MD, a certified psychiatrist who served on the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 5 work group on sexual and gender identity disorders. He also served as a member of the World Health Organization's working group on the classification of sexual disorders and sexual health. Dr. Drescher, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here.
I was actually just recently looking at some polling by Gallup that was asking the question, should homosexual relationships be legal? And it wasn't until around 1993, when I was born, that roughly 50% agreed and 50% disagreed. So the idea that homosexuality could be classified as a mental disorder, that probably would shock a lot of people in my generation. So could you walk us through the history of both kind of what the professionals and the public thought homosexuality was?
Well, many people who do histories of homosexuality as it's perceived in the popular culture usually begin in the 19th century, back in the 1850s. And what you have in the 19th century is you have a shift from the hegemony, if you will, or the authority of religious authority to scientific authority. So many sins in religion started being reclassified by scientists and physicians as illnesses. So demonic possession, for example, became insanity, or drunkenness became alcoholism. And sodomy eventually became homosexuality. Once psychiatrists started naming it, it just became a way to think about it, and many people thought of it as a mental disorder. They didn't call it mental disorders back then. There were exceptions. There were some people, even in the mental health profession, who thought it was a normal variation of human sexuality, but they were not the majority. And in the United States, the first diagnostic manual, the DSM-1, came out in 1952, and there homosexuality was listed as a sexual deviation, as it was in 1968 when the DSM-2 came out.
Gotcha. So how early did cracks form in the public's and the professionals' belief that homosexuality was a mental disorder? Was there like an early study that really concretely countered the belief and made people question it very seriously?
In 1948, Alfred Kinsey, who became a sex researcher, he was actually an insectologist before he started doing his sex research. He became interested in the idea of how do people actually perform sexually. And at the time that he was doing his research, there wasn't a lot of good sexual research available. And so he did something interesting, which was different than what had been done in the past. Historically, the theories about what caused homosexuality were based on studies of people who came to see psychiatrists and mental health professionals who were unhappy about their homosexuality, and on prison populations. What Kinsey did is he went and he did field studies. That is, they sent researchers out to interview people who were not psychiatric patients, but people who were willing to ask interviewers questions. So it wasn't a completely unbiased study because not everybody will answer questions along those lines. And what Kinsey found, his research showed that homosexuality could occur in adult males between anywhere between 10 to 37% of the population. And this was a book that came out in 1948 called Human Sexuality in the Male. It was a scientific research book, which you could get a copy of probably online. It sold 5 million copies. So everybody was into this. Was after World War II. Everybody was interested in sex after World War II, and so he wrote a compendium, 1953, Human Sexuality in the Female. Prior to the Kinsey study, it was thought that homosexuality was unusual, rare, but with numbers like 10 to 37%, it was hard to argue for rare. And Kinsey argued that it could fall within the realm of normal human variation. This was not welcomed by the psychiatric community at the time. The psychiatric community was very psychoanalytically oriented. I'm a psychoanalyst myself, but a later generation. But the psychoanalysts of the 1940s and 50s were not happy with this report. They attacked Kinsey. He wasn't a medical doctor, for one thing, so therefore how dare he opine about what they knew to be the truth. So that was perhaps historically one of the first cracks.
Our guest for part 2 of this series, Professor Kristen Schelt from the University of Chicago, had a lot to say about Evelyn Hooker and her story.
And it took an iconoclast, really like Evelyn Hooker from UCLA, who was a psychologist, to sort of champion the cause in academia. And I think that that's often, like, you have to see these kinds of like activist scholars working with communities who are impacted by whatever the policy is or the cultural belief. Like, I think Evelyn Hooker was able to do that because she was a little bit atypical. She was one of the first women to get a PhD at Johns Hopkins in the 30s. She was unable to actually get a tenure track job at UCLA because the chair at the time told her they had too many women and the men didn't like them. I think they had 2 out of like just a very large department. So she ended up teaching in the extension school at night. She taught night school. One of her students, eventually, she was very kind to him and she got to know him, and eventually he sort of came out to her as gay. And, she was very shocked, where she didn't even know that she knew any gay people, which, was something that was very possible at the time. What really struck her was that her field of psychology and psychiatry described gay men as this particularly abject, sad group of people who were completely unable to function in society. And that was not her experience with this, student and his friends that he'd introduced her to. He sort of put it to her to say, like, you have a responsibility, right? Like, you've met us and like, you have a responsibility to study us.
Wow. That takes a lot of courage. Wow.
Yeah. And I think, she was older. She was in her 50s. She already wasn't taken seriously in the discipline. I don't think she had as much to lose. Like, so much of science is about what is your reputation. I think that's only grown since then, where it's really everybody wants the tenure track job and to get the job security or the grants or whatever. So, I think people often end up kind of following the status quo. Reading from that time, it was also that I think a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists had their own really negative feelings towards gay people. So it wasn't just like, oh, I think it's a disorder. It was like, I find this distasteful, right? And she was able to get funding from the National Institute of Health to do a study of, quote unquote, normal gay men. And by that, it meant they had never been hospitalized for mental health treatment. So they never sought that out, and they were employed. Her argument was everything we know about homosexuality comes from case studies of people who either sought mental health help, or have been involuntarily hospitalized. So of course it's going to look like everyone's in distress if you like select this population, right? And she was much laughed at. Like, people were like, "Oh, normal gay men, you're never going to find them. Like, that's an oxymoron?" And I think again, she was used to being outside and like not taken seriously. So I think she was willing to do this. She eventually published several studies where she showed that if she gave, this group of men the kind of battery of psychiatry tests that they really loved at that time, right? Like the Rorschach tests and all sorts of things like that. And then she gave them to heterosexual men of the same ages and same occupations, and then mixed them up, blinded them, and gave them to her colleagues. They couldn't tell who was gay or who was straight. Wow. And that really shocked the field. That was published in the late 50s, and it was just like this huge blow to what people thought that they knew. Her really careful work trying to think like, well, what are the scientific tools that my colleagues put all of their faith in right now, and how can I use those tools to test whether their biases like hold up right under data? So really using data for a different purpose in some ways.
And now let's hear more from Dr. Drescher.
This was also at odds with the theory of that time, which was that homosexuality was not just a sexual disturbance, but it was a global mental disturbance. Thought of homosexuals as being like psychotic or borderline states. So this was also another rebuke. And this was also, again, none of the 60 subjects were patients. These were non-patients being studied, and it was a reproducible study. Psychiatrists, like people in other fields, often don't read outside their own fields, so they don't welcome information that comes from other fields. So Kinsey was not a psychiatrist, Evelyn Hooker was not a psychiatrist. So the changes really didn't happen right away. It took 25 years between the first publication of the Kinsey study and the removal of homosexuality from the DSM. This is a lesson to your generation. Things take time. And there are several lessons about how things take time in this study as well.
All right, Tina and Mark, after hearing all of that, what are your thoughts?
I would say my first reaction to hearing all of that is the kind of like innovative studies that both of these people had to do just to get the ball started was really bold. The fact that like Kinsey was an insectologist and somehow felt like he had enough scientific and psychological understanding to conduct this study and like write these books. And Evelyn Hooker, who is like primarily a teacher, conducting that kind of a study. I just think it's rather bold of them.
The other aspect of that is both Hooker and Kinsey, like you said, were kind of outside of the core loop of researchers who were studying this at first. Kinsey studied bugs, and Hooker, as a woman, was just kind of not privy to those inside circles. And they both sort of didn't have the currency of respect. She had nothing to lose, essentially. But at the same time, she didn't have the currency to use to try to push it. I thought what was interesting is that even though she wasn't in their circles, what she attempted to do was use their own tests in trying to like use their own methods against them by saying, hey, if you guys believe so heavily in these methods to validate your studies, then I'm going to use them to show you that they're flawed, or like that these conclusions you came to were flawed. And I think that was very wise, because to some degree, you're going to have to meet them halfway.
Yeah, so what did you think about how the Kinsey study was conducted and then how it was received? So I think one of the big deals was that he didn't just grab people who were already preconditioned to find themselves sick. So like we heard, the original studies were grabbed from for the prison population and from people who believed that they had mental health issues or were in a mental health hospital, and treating that as somehow a representative of the whole population of people who believe themselves to be homosexual is I guess I don't know the context of the time, but I feel like that should have been known as bad science. If you're trying to describe a population and you're missing a very, very, very significant part of that population, then your study just isn't valid. And I wonder what it says about research at that time.
I don't think it's an issue of the past to leave out valuable people in your research studies when you're studying an entire population, right? Like drug companies that do trials on people tend to conduct these trials mainly on white men, and women are often left out, and then they discover after this medicine's been approved for the market, that, oh, it has the side effect in like pregnant women or whatever, or they might leave minorities out of the study and then discover, like with Wellbutrin.
Where are you going to find pregnant women? That's so hard.
It's very difficult. They're a rare breed. But I think the practice of assuming we know what all the population is kind of a norm in research.
What struck both of you about Evelyn Hooker as a person? I mean, we talked about, like definitely bold. I guess beyond that, if you had any more thoughts.
Like, I've known about Evelyn Hooker for a while, but I'm kind of struck by the level of compassion that she has. Like, the reason why she decided to like conduct this study that we would assume her colleagues thought she had no business conducting was because she felt compassion towards her students and her students' friends. Or like realize like these people need someone to help them, and I'm the only one who's going to be able to do that. So throws caution to the wind and just goes for it. And I think science tends to make itself out to be this very objective, unemotional like procedure. But the fact that she allowed her emotions to drive her is what allowed her to like incite this massive change.
You can be passionate about the subject, and I'm really glad that Dr. Evelyn Hooker went that route, because clearly her research inspired a lot of change. And even though she probably, like you said, she almost certainly believed in, supporting her students and supporting the queer community in this way, that's why we got it. Or we got this data, we got these outcomes, and we started to push towards queer identity being a little bit more towards the norm. I think it's something that you have to, it's something that you have to balance, but I think it's done more in science than people realize. Like, just because the researcher is supposed to be unbiased, the research itself is supposed to be unbiased, that doesn't mean that the researcher can't have an opinion, if that makes sense. You're going to be biased, even if you think you're unbiased. The professor is rooting for a specific result. You're rooting for a specific result because you think it's going to be awesome. And then you look at the data and you're like, I think that result is there. Like, there are literally tools built into our scientific methods to try to correct for this, right? To try to keep things a little bit less subject to your expectations and wants. And to suggest that people need to come into it objectively, or your science is flawed, is kind of ridiculous, in my opinion.
On that note, actually, so what did you think about the way she conducted her study?
I thought having the external scientists analyze the data was a clever move, because no one would have trusted her analysis anyway. So using like experts in the field to do the analysis and just like only collecting the raw data is very clever.
Yeah, like I said, meeting the community where they are. Usually that's used in a sense of like when you're trying to solve the solutions, trying to figure out how to best help a community, you want to meet the community where they are. In this case, it's a similar idea, but basically if you're going to convince this group of people, then you have to talk to them in their own language. And in this case, it was an outside researcher who, had qualities that the researchers clearly identified with, like being male and in their group, I guess. But it worked. And I think that it was incredibly smart, even if it is like sort of awful that she had to do that. The fact that she did do it was incredibly wise and clearly helped her get her research on the map.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that the NIH funded her study.
That's a fair point. I didn't even think about that.
Not sure how much that cost, but like it was definitely well worth it. All right. I guess any more thoughts on Evelyn Hooker, the history specifically of Evelyn Hooker and the Kinsey study?
I guess to quickly interject, I think that the part, I think it was Dr. Drescher who talked about the status quo and how people were incentivized to follow the status quo. I think that is not necessarily something that has changed too much in the present day. Just like if you have a good position and your job is to generate research, you don't want to ruffle anyone's feathers. You just want to continue doing what you do and have what you have. I mean, that's a very vague statement, but I think that makes sense. And I think that I think we've come up with ways to incentivize coming up with research that like breaks the mold and tackles difficult topics, so to speak. but I think that it's important that we as scientists, we believe in discovering new things, but we should continually try to figure out what are the uncomfortable truths that we're not touching because they're uncomfortable. And can we, I mean, I think it is a little bit more relevant in like more social topics, perhaps, but I still think it's something that any kind of researcher should keep in mind is like, as a scientist, there are invisible barriers sometimes that you're not even realizing are there. They're invisible. And you should realize what kind of status quo are we helping uphold that maybe shouldn't exist. I'm trying to think of another example, and I really should have come with one into this conversation. But I mean, I guess the one here where we're talking about, oh yeah, homosexuality is clearly a mental health disorder, and we should think of it in that direction. I think that clearly was the status quo, and people didn't want to challenge that. And Hooker coming from a different direction, being like, why do we think this? You know, how can we objectively try to challenge this and see if it stands up to the rigors of our tests? I think that's the kind of example, but I wish I had another one in my head.
I'm thinking Galileo. I'm thinking she's straight up the Galileo of
that's
like the 20th
Galileo's
century.
A really good example.
Because also Galileo, he was like, you know what, why don't you just come and look through my telescope and see these things? And she just said the same thing of like, why don't you just do it yourself and see for yourself? I felt like that was really powerful. Let's now turn back to Dr. Drescher and hear his perspective on how confrontational activists got homosexuality taken out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
One of the most interesting stories, of course, is the story of how to get taken out of DSM. It began with the Stonewall riots, in a way. In 1969 in New York City, the police raided a gay bar in Greenwich Village called the Stonewall. That was a typical thing that police did. Gay bars were often run by the mafia, who would pay protection money to the police to not raid them. We had a very corrupt police department back in those days. So they would raid a bar if you didn't pay your protection money, or they would raid the bar as an example to other bars, what happens if you don't. And when they would raid the bar, they would also call journalists to show up so that the journalists can get the names and addresses of everybody that they arrested.
Oh, wow.
so that they could destroy their lives. And this was happening all over the U.S., but in Stonewall in 1969, the patrons of the bar were arrested for the crime of same-sex dancing. That's what was illegal at the time. And so the patrons fought back. They threw bottles and whatever at the police. They triggered 3 days of rioting in Greenwich Village. Although there had been gay rights organizations since the early 1950s in the United States, many of them were very polite, peaceful. They would picket various government buildings, women wearing skirts, men wearing shirts and ties, and everything was very polite. And they would try to get their rights by arguing politely. But by the end of the 60s, you have the African American Civil Rights Movement, the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War. You have the women's rights movement, and suddenly you suddenly have a more radicalized gay rights movement that doesn't believe that we should play nice, with the doctors, because many of them felt that the diagnosis of homosexuality was a major cause of stigma against homosexuality in the 20th century, for people who weren't super religious, that is. And so they came to the American Psychiatric Association. The APA was holding its annual meeting in San Francisco that year. They meet in different cities every year. And that year, the gay rights activists disrupted the APA meeting. They came in, they interrupted a symposium where somebody was talking about curing homosexuality. And all of this disruption got the APA's attention. So the next year, the APA allowed the activists to have a scientific meeting that psychiatrists could attend to, which included two historic figures, Frank Kameny and Barbara Giddings, who were leaders of this movement. And they talked to the psychiatrists who came and said, look, this is a problem. We're not your patients. We're not psychiatric patients. We have our lives. We're functioning pretty well. And what you're doing, as I think there was a guy named Ron Gold put it, he said, stop it, you're making me sick. So that, the use of the diagnosis was being used for purposes that it wasn't really intended for. So what happened next was, apparently in the 1971 APA, the panel of gay activists was very successful. They were invited back to come back in 72, and they said, well, maybe we could have a gay psychiatrist on the panel with us in 1972, to talk to his colleagues. But the problem in 1972 is, where are you going to find an openly gay psychiatrist? Because homosexuality at that time is probably illegal in most of the U.S. states, sodomy laws. And if a doctor gets on stage and comes out, he loses his license, he loses his practice, he may lose his university position. I mean, there were lots of reasons why nobody would come out. But they found someone who was willing to come out in disguise. And usually when I have the slide here, I show the picture of Dr. Anonymous, as they called him. He's called Dr. H. Anonymous for Dr. Homosexual Anonymous. And the man is wearing like a rubber fright mask, a fright wig, an oversized tuxedo, and he's using a voice disguising microphone. If you're listeners, you can just Google Dr. Anonymous and you can see a picture of what he looked like. And that's what an openly gay psychiatrist had to look like in 1972. And it was a Dr. John Fryer, who at the time was living in Philadelphia. He passed away about 2003. And he came out as Dr. Anonymous like in the 1990s, I think. But back then he said, I have to hide who I am, because like a black man who can pass and has to pass, I have to try and pass and not be seen because, you will discriminate against me. You won't hire me. You won't give me a job. And I'm not the only one in the APA. There were other gay psychiatrists, and they would meet clandestinely during the meetings. They would know each other and meet. And this, I think, was a very powerful moment that went on. And in the meantime, the APA is a very complicated organization. At the time, they had 20,000 members. Now we're about 38,000 members. And nothing gets done quickly in APA. So this began in 1970, and over the next 2 or 3 years, committees are meeting to discuss this. And there's a committee that was called the Nomenclature Committee that was meeting with the gay activists who wanted to explain why they should take the diagnosis out. And they met with psychiatrists who didn't want the diagnosis taken out. And they had these meetings going on. And my favorite, Charles Silverstein, who's a psychologist who was working with the gay activist group, knew this history. And he was explaining, he said, he gave an example of a diagnosis from the pre-Civil War South called drapetomania, which was a diagnosis that was given to slaves that kept running away from the plantation because they had a wanderlust. And so there was a growing criticism of the cultural construction of diagnoses, and that and so that the condemnation of homosexuality had more to do with cultural beliefs than with science, or something having to do with nature. It was the recommendation of that committee to the APA Board of Trustees that APA remove the diagnosis of homosexuality from the DSM-2. And it wasn't a majority opinion, but it wasn't a unanimous opinion, but it was like something like 14-2. The Board of Trustees voted to remove the diagnosis. And that was in December of 73. But the people who opposed the removal, who were older psychoanalysts, they were not happy about that, so they petitioned. There was a bylaw which no longer exists that allowed the members of APA to petition the organization if they disagreed with the board about an administrative issue. And this was not an administrative issue, and that bylaw was changed so that it couldn't happen again the way it happened then. They petitioned, they needed 200 signatures, and they forced a referendum on the membership of the APA to determine whether or not the diagnosis should stay or go. And as I said, there were 20,000 APA members at the time, 10,000 members voted, and 58% of the APA members who voted to agree with the Board of Trustees. But they really weren't voting on whether or not homosexuality was an illness, because the majority of psychiatrists in that era had been trained to think of it as an illness. The question they were asked is, do you agree with the Board of Trustees' decision, which was based on an internal APA scientific process? And that's really what the vote was all about. Now, after the vote was over, of course, the losing side didn't take it very well. And they were still, many of them, in positions of authority. The first psychiatric textbook that I read when I was a resident learning psychiatry was written by one of the losing side. And he said something along the lines, truth cannot be decided by a vote.
Wow.
Of course, he doesn't write in his textbook chapter that his side asked for the vote in the first place.
Right.
as gay rights started to be argued over the years, many people who oppose gay rights would say that, well, this was just a vote and this was just politics. But again, they don't say who initiated the political side of the discussion. But that actually begs the question of whether or not you can decide scientific issues by a vote, because in 2006, the International Astronomical Union voted that Pluto is not a planet. And there's no harder science than Pluto. So it's really important to keep in mind that science is often filtered through human subjectivity, and there's no purely objective fact. The APA, when they voted, that they finished the vote, they didn't really yet quite declare that homosexuality is normal. They weren't ready to go there. But if it wasn't an illness anymore, then what was it? What APA did was they took the discussion out of the realm of science and medicine, and they put it into the realm of politics and religion, perhaps even philosophy. And so that the military, religious organizations, governmental organizations, they could no longer use the medical diagnosis as an excuse to discriminate.
Right.
So they had to find other reasons to discriminate. And so a really good example, I think, a friend's daughter in 1996, after she finished Yale Law School, got a job at the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. And I was in D.C. for a meeting, and I had lunch with her, and I said, well, did you have to go through security checks? Because there was a time, in the United States that gay people were seen as security risks and couldn't get government jobs if you're openly gay. Oh, you don't know that? Well, yes.
No, that's incredible.
Yeah. There are books about the lavender scare, like the red scare. So communists and homosexuals had to be kept out of government. In fact, Frank Kameny, one of the activists who helped change the APA, was an astronomer who lost his job in a U.S. government job because they found out that he was gay. But 96, my friend's daughter gets the shot. So they said, no security problem. She goes, in 1993, when they had the big debate about whether or not to let gays in the military, the best argument that the opposing side could come up with were submarines and foxholes. That is, you don't want people in close quarters and submarines and foxholes. You don't want homosexuals there. So since that was the best they could come up with, there was no longer any reason, if your job didn't involve submarines or foxholes, to discriminate against gay people.
Well, we covered a lot here. So let me bring in my fellow hosts, Tina Roman and Mark DeTusa. Let's get to it. So I was thinking we would just kind of recap the different things that Jack told us about. So the first one was about the relationship between the mafia, the police, journalists, and these gay bars. Would anyone like to jump off on that?
I can't help but draw parallels between that story and what's happening right now. I don't think it's to the level where the mafia is coordinating with journalists and all of this to hunt down black activists, but I'm certain there's some degree of that happening within the police force itself.
Definitely.
History repeats itself is mostly what I garnered from that segment. And also nice protests are good. They're necessary. They're not always enough.
Right, because this was so long after Evelyn Hooker's study. That should have been very clear to scientists.
Right, if society progresses forward based only on the principles of justice and fairness, and once inequality is brought into the light and these biased beliefs are disproven, then things should just move along on their own. They don't. That's not how it happens. It's not a natural process. People have to fight for it, quite literally.
I think it's important to note, it's easy to draw parallels. This is being recorded not too long after June and July 2020, where we had a lot of, we had police shootings and a lot of discussion around these sorts of things and riots. And I think it's really great that I learned about the Stonewall riots, not through this, but not too long ago, honestly, because we just had an anniversary of it as well. Stonewall riots 50 years ago at this point. It's 1970, right? So
yeah, I think it was 69. So it was probably...
Oh, maybe it was last year. It was the 50th anniversary. Right. Okay. So I think it's good that I had heard about it, because these riots... And Dr. Drescher put it pretty well, that there were very, suit and tie, sort of nice protests, and they had happened for a while, and they didn't really get the same traction that the Stonewall riots did. And I think the fact that we're saying it like this many years later, that the Stonewall riots is kind of one of the watershed moments for this movement, is it's something that we really should be paying attention to. I think the other word that Dr. Drescher used was uncomfortable. So they protested the APA meeting and they essentially shut it down, and that made people uncomfortable. They had to react to it. You need to force people to react. Going back to the status quo, you have to challenge the status quo. That's what researchers should be aspiring for. I mean, this is definitely a different aspect of that, but it's something that we should be actively thinking about. How can we change the status quo to better help society? And I think we'd be hypocritical if we weren't thinking about how making people uncomfortable or making them realize uncomfortable truths is a huge part of that.
Yeah, definitely. One thing I was thinking about too on this idea that the mafia and the police were kind of having a battle and having a little, negotiation and collaboration between each other, and then we're basically using gay people as a prop. And it made me think a little bit about criminalizing marijuana and how marijuana can fuel like people who sell drugs, or who it essentially is a way of funding illicit behavior. And so people who are involved in illicit behavior like the mafia then have a funding source. And so in a way, having these gay bars be illegal was helping to fund the mafia. So yeah, now on to the nice protest versus the confrontational protest versus like debating, etc. And like the rioting, actually, fighting with the police. So we definitely touched on that a bunch. It seems pretty clear that needed to happen at this point.
I would agree with that. I feel like because like the violence going from the direction of like lawful society towards gay people was escalating and escalating and escalating without them standing up for themselves and fighting back, I think it just would have continued to escalate, right? And that's what makes it feel so similar to now.
So yeah, and then the activists actually going into the APA. I found this fascinating because I mentioned this in one of the interviews, but the fact, like, I cannot imagine activists coming to like an American Chemical Society meeting. And in the APA's case, the activists actually started like throwing dildos at the psychiatrists and like really raucous behavior to make sure that they were like being heard and could not be ignored. So yeah, what are your thoughts on actually going to these like professional meetings as an activist?
I think it's a clever approach to bringing attention to a problem. Like, I'm thinking if we wanted to put our foot down and say we need to change how we hire faculty to make it not discriminatory against people of color, a good way to make that an immediate we need to do this now problem is to go to a big huge conference and shut it down. I think that's a really valid nonviolent way to demand change immediately.
I think another thing that interested me about this history that we just recapped was, again, with the APA conference, the Dr. Anonymous. I thought it was interesting, the quote that you're making me sick. And like at first when you hear that, you're like, you think of the idiomatic way, like, what you're saying is making me sick. But obviously what they mean is you are diagnosing me with something. And that diagnosis, my brain goes to like, for like health insurance, like if you have a quote pre-existing condition, you can't get health insurance. I don't think that's what they were going at, but point being is giving somebody some sort of condition, it gives you a social stigma, right? Like it says that we have determined that this thing is wrong and that you would be better off not having it, basically, right? And I think that really thinking very deeply about, well, is this bad? Like, what exactly about it is bad? Should we call it mental illness? Like, we're having this same discussion with the autism spectrum, right? So you're making me sick. It just makes me feel like, yeah, these people are completely normal. There are psychologists that are, queer, and they are respected parts of your community, and that's the easiest way to get people to be empathizing with you is you're already in their circle. You're already people they know. And I think, again, like I think that was a very smart, I mean, it's difficult because like if you out yourself, There's a reason why in the closet is like an idiom, right? Because it's so you're exposing yourself to so much potential hate and ridicule for something like this that, I mean, so wrongly, but all the same. But if you can find a way to communicate it to your peers, like, hey, like, you respect me, I'm this, like, that's a powerful moment. And I think Dr. Drescher said the same, that it was a powerful moment. And I'm so glad that they could have those frank discussions and start mending those bridges.
Yeah, I agree with what you were saying about the parallels between that. You're diagnosing me as abnormal when I'm a perfectly functioning person, to the disability community trying to be recognized as, like, just because I'm paralyzed or just because I have a developmental, air quotes, disorder doesn't mean my life isn't worth living. And we can see that there are studies that show that disabled people get worse health care because the doctors assume that their lives are not worth saving because of their own internalized biases about these, like, diagnoses that make them be considered, like, abnormal, less than, broken. So yeah, it sounds really familiar. And the fact that, like, this is, like, the disability community is still having this conversation, which echoes this homosexuality disorder conversation today, means there's still a lot more that we have to learn and a lot more that we have to contend with as a society and as scientists.
Definitely so many echoes throughout history, just constant.
In any case, though, I think it's important to kind of bring this all back into the context of science, in that science science has this cachet that gives, like, the veneer of legitimacy to your exploits. And this can be used for bad and for good. For example, the science that attempted to say that male brains were, like, better or, like, larger than female brains and therefore were, like, better conditioned for, math and science or whatever, like that. I mean, obviously the study was bogus, but let's say, people could make a study like that and claim that this was science, right? And it was used against people. But on the other hand, that legitimacy can be wielded for good. And Dr. Hooker's and Dr. Kinsey's, their studies were wielded for good and were used for this change. And I think that the legitimacy, or the veneer legitimacy that science gave, obviously played into that. And I think that scientists, they have that role, and we should be thinking about that kind of role.
100%. And, like, with all the disturbances that they made at the APA meeting, they were invited back and given a panel, probably because the leaders could go talk to the APA and say, look, there is this data and this is why we're upset. And they had some way of really translating that ground. That definitely helps, although you shouldn't need that in this case where a community is being so oppressed. What did you guys think about the APA committee's process and that whole voting situation?
I mean, I think, to me, what that process shows is, like, how much of a social construct normal is. That we can get a bunch of bigwigs in a room and they can get very upset and have a vote about it, and tomorrow, normal is different now. Like, we just make up the rules as we go. It's not a scientific thing at all at that point. It's just, like, feelings, like human emotions.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if that's exactly what I would take away from it, because the vote itself, and Dr. Drescher talks about this, was basically they were saying, do you agree with the process that the APA has in place to evaluate the science and the research that psychologists have done? And he makes a point of saying that the vote was about whether you believed in that process, rather than do you believe that homosexuality is a psychological disorder. And I think that the importance of that statement is that, at least to me, that science is, a single scientist can be wrong. And that's, in fact, a single scientist should try to be challenging the status quo, like I said, but it is the purpose of scientific societies and the scientific community to validate that research and to check it themselves and to believe in the process of the scientific process of society. And so for these psychologists, I'm not saying like they're the bravest, coolest people ever, but for them to say, you know, we don't necessarily agree with this specific thing, but if the APA board believes in the research they're doing, then we should follow along with this. I think that speaks to the sociological aspects of science and how it works. And I think that in and of itself is an important lesson to take home.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I would love to learn more about what actually happened in those committee meeting discussions where the activists were talking and discussing with the psychiatrists on the board. You know, that process of convincing someone over, it sounded like 2 years, is going to be very different than, just taking like a spur of the moment vote. I think in science, ideally, when scientists are tasked to really do their job of like investigating the science and they're tasked with putting their emotions on the side, then there can be more of that objectivity in a vote. But like you were saying, Tina, when it's just like, all right, well, do you agree with this one thing? Because they knew what the decision would actually mean in the end. You know, like I'm sure that the people believed most of the process of the APA and then would have just voted like, I don't like this process. So I'm sure it's a mix of both. But that most of them were like, I'm sure a lot of those people who voted yes, maybe were like, you know what, I got to just trust. Like I know these people who were on the committee and said yes, and I believe it. I believe that they would know what they're talking about and would have looked through all the science. What I thought was nuts was that Dr. Drescher had in his textbook that the textbook said that it was the wrong decision. That seemed bananas. What did you guys think of that?
It's interesting that they said this was the wrong decision. By what quota? Or what standard is what my question would be to that textbook.
Yeah, I feel like, because also in Kristen's interview, she also mentioned that her professor who first taught her this information also said that the decision was wrong. And listeners might not know this, but Kristen and Drescher went to graduate school probably about 30 years apart. There are still like scientists in the field that are arguing against this decision and trying to push the arbitrary line of what is normal and what is not back the other way. Like it's going to be an ongoing thing. We have to to combat that, we have to continually reaffirm the scientific findings that homosexuals are completely functional people who are not in fact ill.
100%. And you know, that polling data that I mentioned at the very beginning about it being like roughly 50-50 agreed that homosexuals should be legal for them to just be in a relationship. That is now okay because it's like 75% of people agree with that. But that means that there's 25% of people who don't. And that's like 75 million people. So it's still definitely out there, and it's not a settled matter. That's for sure. I guess last thing, I had known that I had known vaguely about like the lavender scare and that like gays were kept out of government, but I didn't realize that it was because of a security risk and that they really thought that like somehow gays were gonna, I don't even know what, like I can't personally imagine what was going through their minds to keep them out of government. So that just blew me away. I don't know what y'all think about that.
So for me, as a queer person, that I can see pretty clearly. Queer women are usually like painted as like predatory because men are predatory creatures towards women. So women who are attracted to women must clearly be predatory and manipulative. And I think that the way we look at gender and sexuality, where men are like hunting women, now gay men are hunting other men, and that's really scary, right? We can't like let our men be attacked the way we let men attack women. That's absurd. Right? And I think wow. That's where the security risk mentality comes from.
That's a scary point. That's a scary point, because then it's like, well, if that means if you're a woman in government, you are already at risk.
Right. They're not gonna think about it that deeply, where they realize like that's the underlying assumption.
Oh, well, then we couldn't hire men. That's an issue, right? I think. I do think this ties back to the fact that there's a diagnosis for being, homosexual. Because that clearly is, if they can, somebody or hiring for a government job, it's like, well, it says here that you're on your health that you had to submit for this job that you're homosexual, and we don't give jobs to people who are homosexual. Like, clearly, like, that's just like that's just showing like how making somebody sick is it's just detrimental.
Let's go back to Dr. Drescher to discuss the fight for transgender rights in psychiatry and in this medical professional space today. Let's get to it. Is there another issue in the LGBTQ community right now that you feel is similar to homosexuality is a mental disorder?
Well, there's still a DSM diagnosis called gender incongruence, which can be used to help people who require medical treatments. And we were faced with the question when we were revising the DSM-5 from 2008 to 2013 about people were asking us to take it out of the DSM the way homosexuality was taken out in 1973. This was the first DSM that really came out in the modern internet age. So it was under a lot of public scrutiny with front page articles in the New York Times about the process. And I wrote a paper and I was intrigued by the question, what are the similarities? What are the differences between the homosexuality diagnosis and the transgender diagnosis? What used to be called gender identity disorder, which is now called gender incongruence. And the one difference is that in modern medical systems today, in order to access care, you need a diagnosis. So gay people didn't need a homosexuality diagnosis to get the treatment for depression or anxiety or anything else. But people who want to access hormone treatments and have their insurance company pay for it or surgery, they will need a diagnosis. So one of the problems we had is that we had to balance the issues of the stigma of having a diagnosis versus access to care. We thought that access to care was more important. It was a lesser of two evils. But the DSM was very binary. It's either in or it's out. But then I was invited to work on the World Health Organization's Diagnostic Manual, the ICD-11, and that's a different ballgame because the ICD covers all diagnoses. It includes any diagnosis that you now go to see if you go see a physician for any medical condition and you're using your insurance, your doctor will include an ICD diagnosis as well as what they did to you during the visit. So the ICD includes neurology, surgeries, everything. So what we could do in ICD is we could keep the diagnosis, but we could take it out of the mental disorder section, which is what we did. Great. So the diagnosis in the ICD-11 is called gender incongruence. And it's in a new chapter called Conditions Related to Sexual Health, not a mental disorder.
Right.
And also, it doesn't even have to be a disorder to be in the ICD because menopause is a diagnosis, and that's not a disorder. That's a normal life event. And normal deliveries have an ICD diagnosis.
So for our final discussion, let me bring in my fellow host. What would you have done in that situation? Would you have tried to get transgender as a diagnosis out of the DSM, or would you have left it in for these treatment purposes? I think one thing that maybe Drescher didn't get a chance to talk about, what I could have asked him was, are there any organizations or institutions that are using this DSM diagnosis to actually hurt the trans community and to prevent them from leading a normal life? What were your thoughts on that?
It's definitely a cost-benefit analysis thing. Is how much benefit does it being an illness give people who are transgender versus how much does it cost them, right? Are they being discriminated against because of this, or will they not be able to get their treatment if we don't have it? And I feel like you couldn't really answer that question without a study, ironically.
Yeah. Which I'm hoping they did. I'm presuming they did.
But the other thing I was thinking about is, why does it have to be a disorder? Why can't it just be a condition? We have health things all the time that aren't considered bad or moral failings or something that need to be stigmatized. And we just treat them because they need to be treated, and that's that.
So, okay, my brain, I guess I'm going to get it twisted, but the thing that I was thinking of saying was basically that it's really interesting, again, talking about pre-existing conditions. Like, on one level, you need to be able to be diagnosed with something in order to be like, okay, you can get care. But then as soon as you're diagnosed with something, all of a sudden, it shows up, say, on your job applications potentially, or it can. I actually don't know what, again, I haven't applied for jobs yet because I'm a graduate student, so maybe that's wrong. But I do believe that there's some aspect to that, and essentially there's cost-benefit analysis, but I see the point, like, in order to access care, you need to have something that society agrees you need care for. But like, you think about like diabetes, like nobody goes, oh, you have diabetes, huh? Like, you're an awful person for having diabetes, but I don't think that there's a real specific difference in how it's condition. Diabetes wouldn't be like a mental condition, so maybe that's not the best comparison, right?
Yeah. I think that's the tough part.
I think a better parallel would be autism.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right, because autism is like a mind situation. It's unclear as to how biological it is versus environmental. We don't really understand how it works, just like we don't understand how gender dysphoria works. But we know that people who are autistic definitely need accommodations sometimes. Sometimes they don't. And, to give them that level of care, like, for example, a home health aide, if they need that, they need to be able to be labeled as autistic. But what if someone is a high-functioning autistic person and is trying to get a little bit of accommodation in college but doesn't want to be assumed to be an idiot?
Mm-hmm. It fundamentally comes down to the insurance system that we have now. Because if we didn't have an insurance system, then the doctors could just prescribe whatever, and they wouldn't even have to say, like, it's for this reason. I don't think, unless, I guess we wouldn't want doctors, whatever. But honestly, like, we would just have to trust the doctors.
It seems to get complicated.
Could get a little complicated. Someone's thought about that, though, right? Hopefully. But it would be easier if just, it doesn't have to get into, like, a mental disorder versus a blah disorder. It's just like, well, you need these drugs because of this. Done. Any more final thoughts or anything?
It's, of course, we've talked about this to some degree already, but just to reiterate, I think it's important to see the history of a topic like this that admittedly is still relevant, of course. I mean, you could even reference the discussion around taking, not allowing queer people in the military again, that Trump, I forget if it was an executive order or if it even passed, or it's always kind of a big mess, but that's still relevant, right? Like these sorts of stigmas still exist. But even still, how the history of this, as we can also see as, deep, or it's been replicated with many issues, and most notably in recent times with Black Lives Matter and rights movements, right? I mean, it's rights for LGBTQ, rights for minorities and Black color. I actually don't know I guess people of color, is that the most appropriate term?
People of color works.
Okay, I apologize for that. But regardless, I think that it's really important to study the history. That's why you take history classes in college and high school and before that, hopefully. There's a reason why I feel like liberal arts education, quote unquote, is important, because these different aspects still apply in science. Being able to know, like, the history of the topic you're studying and how its societal societal effects. How does your research tie into that? Maybe it's more relevant for certain topics like the Higgs boson. Like, I don't think the people were thinking too hard about how the Higgs boson would affect, like, society per se, but there is still some sort of, you should be aware of the history and how your research plays into it. That's one aspect.
Echoing off of that, I feel like when these conversations about equality and discrimination start happening among scientists in these spaces, scientists act like no one's ever studied this before, and there's no, how can we possibly confront these problems? I don't know. It's impossible. And I try to remind people, we have done this before. There is a protocol that exists. We can read the paper. But the paper is written in the language of, like, history and sociology. And scientists are very hesitant to engage in those fields.
Yeah, definitely. It's easier for me to just like listen to a podcast than to read a book because like whatever, I'm at the bench doing work or whatever, but it's harder to imagine that you should take the time to do this, but you absolutely should. And I mean, this is getting way off topic, but I think that in general, people need to like allow themselves to use time for not just like relaxing or work, but like something kind of in between and like learning about our society a little more. I think that would help everyone. From speaking with Dr. Drescher, we can see how historical and cultural context has a real and lasting effect on the way we do science. What I hope our listeners will take away from this is that science is rarely truly objective. Science is performed by humans, so the context in which we live and biases that we have affect our conclusions. It is important for us as scientists to understand these historical and cultural contexts in order to avoid propagating biased and discriminatory science. The next part of this episode will discuss cultural biases in academia and how they affect both underrepresented minorities in science and also what scientists choose to research. We hope to see you then, and we thank you for listening to The Human Variable.
Funding for The Human Variable was provided by Research America. That's Research America, who are dedicated to elevating the importance of scientific research, innovation, and public health in the national conversation. The host of this episode was Jeffrey Dewey. That's it from The Human Variable. Until next time, be a part of the solution.